Imagine a courtroom hushed with anticipation, the air thick with judgment. But instead of a seasoned criminal, a tiny figure stands before the bench. A 10-year-old girl, her arms cradling a whimpering infant. In her eyes, not tears of self-pity, but a burning plea for justice. This is not a scene from a distant tragedy. It's the raw, unfolding story of Mila, a child forced to confront a world that seems determined to silence her. What brought her to this formidable place, and what shocking events will shatter the courtroom's initial mockery? A 10-year-old girl, no taller than the witness stand itself, stood in the middle of a crowded courtroom. The sheer weight of the gazes upon her felt like a physical burden, pressing down on her small shoulders. In her arms, nestled within a thin, worn blanket, her infant brother cried, a weak, mewling sound that tugged at the edges of the tense silence. Mila's own eyes, wide and dark, were pools of a desperation that belied her tender years. It wasn't the pleading look of a child seeking comfort. It was a stark, unwavering demand for justice, a silent accusation aimed at the indifferent faces surrounding her. Yet, the response she received was not one of sympathy or understanding. Instead, a ripple of mocking laughter spread through the room, bouncing off the polished wood of the benches and the high, arched ceiling. Each chuckle, each derisive snort, was a tiny shard of ice piercing her already wounded spirit. Who is this girl, this fragile figure, standing against the formidable backdrop of the legal system? Why does a child, barely out of infancy herself, have to stand before a judge, her small voice the only weapon against the cold machinery of the law? What unseen battles has she already fought? What silent horrors has she witnessed that have led her to this desperate stand? And what happened next, in the hushed confines of that courtroom, that could possibly silence the cynical laughter and leave the entire assembly in stunned, disbelieving silence? This is not just a story. It is a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the resilience of the human heart in the face of unimaginable adversity, a powerful and deeply emotional narrative that will grip you from the first word and refuse to let go. If you are drawn to stories that delve into the depths of human experience, stories that resonate with meaning and truth, then make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives. Thank you for being here, for choosing to witness this unfolding drama. We urge you to watch until the very end, for it is in the final, heart-wrenching moments that the true weight of Mila's journey, the moment that moved even the most hardened hearts to tears, will be revealed. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, every available seat filled with spectators, lawyers, and court officials. The atmosphere was so thick with tension it felt almost suffocating, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone present. A low hum of murmurs rippled through the room, hushed whispers and speculative glances darting towards the small figure in the center. But the moment the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the courtroom creaked open, their hinges groaning under their considerable weight, an almost supernatural silence descended. Every cough was stifled, every rustle of paper ceased. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the room, swallowing every sound whole. And then she stepped inside, a small, thin girl, her frame barely substantial enough to carry the weight of her own sorrow, let alone the infant in her arms. Her bare feet, smudged with dust and bearing the faint red marks of recent hardship, made no sound on the cold, hard-tiled floor. In her frail arm, she cradled a newborn baby, wrapped in a tattered, once white blanket that offered little protection against the chill. The baby whimpered weakly, a soft, heartbreaking sound that spoke of hunger and cold. Each of the girl's hesitant steps echoed softly in the cavernous space, a stark counterpoint to the hushed expectancy of the crowd, causing more than a few people in the room to frown in confusion, their initial amusement giving way to a flicker of unease. Mila's large, round eyes, the color of deep twilight, quickly scanned the room, her gaze flitting from face to face, meeting countless scrutinizing gazes filled with a mixture of curiosity and something akin to morbid fascination. Some of the onlookers, their expressions etched with a weary cynicism born of witnessing too much human suffering, shook their heads slowly, a silent commentary on the tragic tableau before them. Others, perhaps less jaded, smirked, their lips curling into expressions of disbelief, as if this entire scene was nothing more than a bizarre, meaningless joke, an unwelcome interruption to the serious business of the court. She stopped abruptly in the very center of the vast courtroom, her small frame seeming even more diminutive in the open space. Her grip on her baby brother tightened instinctively, a fierce protectiveness flaring in her eyes as she felt his fragile breath warm against her arm, a tiny anchor in the storm of her fear. From the elevated bench, a formidable presence looming over the room, Judge Sterling slowly removed his reading glasses, the movement deliberate and measured. His gaze, sharp and assessing, lingered on Mila, cold and piercing, seeming to dissect her very being. He was a man etched by years of dispensing justice, his graying hair and stern face reflecting a reputation for handing down ruthless judgments without sentimentality. To him, a courtroom was a sacred space, a place for logical arguments, for serious cases with clear legal precedent, not a stage for some bizarre, emotionally charged spectacle involving a child. He took a deep breath, the sound amplified in the sudden quiet, leaned back in his imposing leather chair, and a slow, almost imperceptible half-smile flickered across his lips, a hint of sardonic amusement in his eyes. A child carrying another child. His voice finally broke the silence, the words dragging out, each syllable laced with a cold disbelief that was as sharp as a blade slicing through the air. One hand, large and weathered, tapped lightly on the polished wooden desk before him, his gaze never leaving the small, unyielding figure standing in the center of the room. "This is a courtroom," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument, not a playroom. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Laughter erupted instantly, a reflexive response to the judge's unexpected mockery, a collective exhale of the tension that had been building. Some of the seasoned lawyers, their faces usually impassive, chuckled and shook their heads, a shared moment of cynical amusement. A few of the court officials, their expressions betraying a mixture of surprise and disdain, raised their brows in silent commentary. A well-dressed man in the front row, his expensive suit a stark contrast to Mila's ragged appearance, leaned toward his equally affluent colleague, whispering something behind a gloved hand before the two snickered together, their eyes fixed on the girl with a detached curiosity. The spectators in the crowded gallery made no effort to hide their enjoyment of this strange, unsettling scene. They looked at Mila as if she were some kind of misplaced curiosity, a joke that had inexplicably wandered into the serious world of grown-ups. A tiny, scrawny, dirty girl with bare feet, no money, no lawyer, no visible support of any kind, standing in the middle of a formal courtroom with a newborn infant clutched in her arms. To them, it was an absurd spectacle, laughable and ultimately insignificant, certainly not worthy of their serious attention. Yet, amidst the echoing waves of derision, Mila remained still, an unmoving island in a sea of mockery. The laughter, sharp and cruel, washed over her, but did not break her. She did not lower her head in shame, did not take a single step back in retreat, nor did she shed even a single tear. Her wide eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion and fear, showed no sign of weakness, no hint of the vulnerability that might have been expected from a child in her position. Instead, they held an unusual, almost unnerving fierce determination, a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from a place far deeper than her tender years suggested. She clutched the thin, threadbare blanket tighter around her brother, a silent promise of protection, feeling his small body tremble faintly from the lingering cold. The laughter swirling around her was like 1,000 unseen blades slicing into her young heart, each sound a fresh wound. But nothing, it seemed, could make her yield, could break the unwavering resolve in her gaze. Mila had not come here to be a source of amusement, a punchline to a callous joke. She had come for one reason and one reason only. No matter how much they laughed, no matter how foolish they thought she was, Their derision would not change the fundamental truth that had driven her to this desperate act. A woman sitting far away in the gallery, her face softened by an unexpected wave of empathy, furrowed her brows slightly, her gaze wavering at the sight of the small, solitary figure in the center of the room. Beside her, a bespectacled man with a scholarly air scribbled furiously in a notepad, his pen scratching against the paper as if trying to decipher the puzzle of why a child had appeared in this formal setting. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the initial outburst of laughter began to subside, the echoes fading into a lingering hum of discomfort. But the air remained thick with a palpable sense of contempt and disregard. No one in this room, it seemed, truly cared why Mila was here, what desperate circumstances had driven her to this extraordinary act. No one genuinely wanted to hear what this child, this insignificant interruption, might have to say. To them, this was just a ridiculous situation, an unwelcome disruption in the middle of far more important trials, cases involving adults, legal complexities, and significant consequences. Mila, however, refused to be diminished. She lifted her head high, her small chin tilted defiantly, her eyes blazing with an unexpected fire in the room filled with doubtful, condescending stares. She took a deep breath, a visible intake of courage, then spoke, her voice surprisingly firm and clear in the vast courtroom. "This baby," she declared, her gaze sweeping across the silent faces, "is all I have left, and I'm here for justice." Her words, though spoken by a child, rang with an undeniable conviction, seeping into every corner of the once noisy courtroom, freezing the remaining air. The last vestiges of chuckles, the lingering mocking headshakes from moments ago, were abruptly swallowed whole by a suffocating silence, a silence born not of amusement, but of a dawning unease. Some of the spectators, their initial cynicism shaken, furrowed their brows in confusion. A few of the lawyers, who had been idly flipping through documents, halted their movements, their eyes now fixed on the small, unyielding child standing in the center of the room. Judge Sterling, who had been lounging in his chair with an air of detached amusement, suddenly stiffened, his posture becoming rigid, his gaze turning sharper, more intent. A court clerk, who had been meticulously arranging files, placed his pen down with a deliberate click, his hands instinctively tightening around the stack of documents before him, as if trying to reassess the entire situation. No one spoke. No one dared to laugh anymore. Only Mila, small in stature but unyielding in spirit, remained standing tall in the heart of the courtroom, clutching her baby brother tightly against her chest. That profound silence, heavy with unspoken questions and a shift in the courtroom's collective consciousness, lasted only a few heartbeats before, bang, the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the courtroom burst open with a violent force, slamming against the wall behind them with a deafening crash that echoed through the stunned silence. Several people jerked around in their seats in alarm, their composure shattered by the sudden intrusion. Some gasped audibly in shock, their eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of fear, while a few of the court officials, their faces paling, immediately sprang to their feet, their hands instinctively reaching for some unseen source of authority. A nearby police officer, his hand resting casually on his belt, instinctively tightened his grip on his holster, his sharp eyes darting toward the entrance, assessing the potential threat. A cold gust of air from the hallway rushed into the room, carrying with it an invisible tension that made the already stifling atmosphere even heavier, a sense of impending chaos. In the stark light spilling from the corridor, a towering figure stormed into the courtroom, radiating a palpable force of barely contained rage, like the eye of a brewing tempest entering a calm space. Grayson barreled into the room, his large frame filling the doorway, his face flushed a furious red, his breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of a desperate, uncontrolled fury. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned wildly with an unbridled rage that seemed to consume him from within. His twisted expression, a grotesque mask of fury, contorted his features, deepening the harsh furrows on his forehead and around his tightly clenched mouth. He swept his incandescent glare across the stunned faces in the room, as if ready to ignite anyone who dared to stand in his way, his very presence a violation of the courtroom's solemnity. Standing amid the stunned gazes of the crowd, his chest heaving with uncontrolled emotion, he roared in fury, his voice a thunderous bellow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "You have no right to be here." His voice, amplified by the sudden silence, shattered the heavy quiet that had just begun to settle over the courtroom, replacing it with a fresh wave of shock and confusion. Whispers, sharp and urgent, erupted across the room as several people in the gallery recognized the man who had just so violently barged in, their initial curiosity now tinged with a growing sense of alarm. Several audience members in the front row, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning understanding, whipped their heads around, their curiosity and confusion now unmistakably laced with fear. A court clerk, his face pale, opened his mouth to call for order, his voice trembling, but the words died on his lips at the sight of Grayson's raw, unadulterated rage. This wasn't mere anger. This was a primal fury, raw and unbridled, the desperate rage of a man cornered like a wild beast, his composure completely shattered. A few of the officers in the room immediately rested their hands more firmly on their holsters, their eyes narrowed, poised to act if necessary, sensing the volatile energy emanating from the intruder. Mila flinched instinctively at the sudden, violent intrusion, her small body recoiling as if struck. Her grip on Leo tightened protectively, pulling her little brother closer against her chest, a fragile shield against the storm that had just erupted. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her bare feet remained rooted to the spot. She locked her wide, terrified eyes with Grayson's furious gaze, refusing to look away, even as her heart hammered violently in her chest, a frantic drumbeat of fear. She had known, deep down, that he would come, that he wouldn't simply let her go, but she hadn't expected him to arrive so soon, with such unrestrained fury. And now he was here, standing right in front of her, his rage a tangible force in the room, boiling in every taut muscle of his body, his entire being radiating a dangerous energy, ready to pounce at any moment. Leo, sensing the sudden spike in tension, the palpable fear radiating from his sister, squirmed uneasily in her arms and let out a weak, whimpering cry, a small sound of distress that seemed to further fuel Grayson's anger. Grayson took a forceful step toward Mila, his heavy footfalls echoing ominously on the tiled floor, but an alert police officer immediately raised a firm arm to block his path, his stance resolute. "You're not allowed to disrupt court proceedings. Step back now," the officer ordered, his voice firm despite the palpable tension, his hand still resting on his holster, his gaze razor-sharp and unwavering. But Grayson barely spared him a glance, his burning eyes, filled with a chilling menace, remained fixed on Mila. His voice, hoarse with a barely suppressed fury, grated through the tense silence. "You think you can run?" he snarled, each word a venomous hiss slipping through gritted teeth. "You think you can come here, cry in front of them, and everything will change?" Mila pressed her lips together tightly, a thin line of defiance against the tremor that ran through her small frame. Her hands, still clutched protectively around her baby brother, trembled almost imperceptibly. She didn't want to appear weak in front of him, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, but her body betrayed the terror that was coiling in her spine, a cold serpent of dread. The collective attention of the crowded courtroom remained locked onto the dramatic confrontation unfolding between the small, resolute girl and the towering, enraged man. Whispers, like rustling leaves in a sudden gust of wind, spread through the room as people murmured to each other, their eyes darting back and forth, questioning the nature of the connection between the child and the furious intruder. Why was he so enraged? What was the source of this raw, unbridled fury? Why did he act as if this was something deeply personal a violation that demanded immediate retribution. Judge Sterling, who had remained a silent observer of this explosive interruption, his expression unreadable, finally spoke. His voice, no longer carrying the dismissive mockery from before, now resonated with a firm authority that cut through the charged atmosphere. "Who are you?" he asked slowly, his sharp gaze sweeping over Grayson with a newfound caution, a flicker of concern replacing his initial amusement. A court clerk beside him, his face pale and beads of sweat forming on his brow, leaned in and whispered something urgently in the judge's ear, his words causing Judge Sterling's expression to briefly shift into a deep contemplation, a weighing of the potential ramifications of this unexpected turn of events. Grayson didn't answer the judge immediately. His eyes, still blazing with a possessive fury, remained glued to Mila, as if she were the embodiment of the greatest betrayal he had ever faced. Then, taking a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to momentarily quell the storm raging within him, he finally turned his attention to the judge. He spoke, not with the booming rage of his initial entrance, but with a chillingly controlled venom that dripped from every carefully enunciated word. "I'm the only one who has the right to decide this girl's fate," he declared, a cruel smirk twisting his lips into a triumphant sneer. "She belongs to me. Me." The air in the room seemed to physically chill, an icy wave washing over the stunned spectators. Uneasy glances were exchanged, a silent acknowledgement of the disturbing possessiveness in Grayson's claim. None dared to speak, the previous murmurs now completely silenced by the palpable tension. A police officer, standing near the aisle, took a measured step forward, his hand now resting firmly on his holster, his eyes narrowed, as if preparing for immediate action. Mila felt her entire body freeze, as though Grayson's words had tangible weight, binding her in invisible chains of fear and dread. And then, in the midst of that eerie, suffocating silence, a voice rang out, small but unwavering, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a shard of glass. Mila met Grayson's furious gaze, no longer with the wide-eyed terror of a cornered animal, but with a nascent, fierce defiance that flickered in the depths of her dark eyes. "You have no right to decide anything about me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady and unyielding, a testament to the raw courage born of desperation, "and I will prove it." The courtroom rippled with a collective gasp of shock, a wave of murmurs washing over the stunned assembly. This unexpected display of defiance from such a small, seemingly powerless figure hung in the air, a challenge thrown down in the face of overwhelming threat. But this was only the beginning, a single spark igniting in the darkness. "Stay with us. Do not turn away." This story, Mila's desperate journey for justice, is just beginning, and it is fraught with shocking twists and heart-pounding moments that will leave you breathless. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more gripping narratives, and continue watching to see what unfolds next. Thank you for your unwavering support. 2 days ago, standing before the formidable presence of the court, the memory of what had transpired in the days leading up to this moment remained etched in Mila's mind with a clarity that was both a torment and a driving force. The events are not distant recollections fading with time. They were vivid, visceral, like a deep wound that refused to heal, throbbing with a constant, dull ache. 2 days ago, she and her baby brother were still trapped in a suffocating darkness, their bodies weakened by hunger, their spirits clinging to a fragile thread of hope, with no one in the vast, indifferent world seeming to care about their very existence. Darkness had been their constant companion, a heavy blanket engulfing the cramped, airless room that had become their prison. There were no windows to offer a glimpse of the outside world, no comforting rays of sunlight to pierce the gloom. Only a small, grimy gap high up in one of the cracked walls allowed a faint, weak sliver of light to struggle through the thick layer of dust that clung to every surface, a pathetic reminder of the world beyond their confinement. The air inside was damp and foul, a stagnant miasma of stale odors, the scent of things long forgotten, mixed with the faint, weak breath of 2 children struggling for survival. Mila would curl up in the coldest corner of the room, her small body wrapped tightly around Leo, feeling his tiny frame tremble in intermittent waves of cold and hunger. The newborn whimpered incessantly, his small lips dry and cracked, his tiny hands grasping feebly at the empty air, as if searching for a warmth that was perpetually absent. Mila would clutch him tighter, pressing her thin cheek against the soft down of his head, whispering feeble reassurances that even to her own ears sounded hollow and unconvincing. Her own stomach was a tight knot of gnawing hunger, a constant reminder of their desperate plight. 2 days had passed with nothing but a single, stale piece of bread, a meager offering that she had selflessly given entirely to Leo, her own needs secondary to his fragile existence. She would scan the oppressive confines of their prison, her desperate gaze sweeping over the narrow, crumbling walls, searching in vain for any sign of escape, any glimmer of hope. A cold, unyielding iron door, thick and heavy, blocked every possible way out, secured on the outside by a large, rusty padlock, a stark symbol of their utter captivity in the suffocating darkness. She had tried to open it countless times, her small hands beating against the unyielding metal with all the strength in her frail body, but nothing had changed. Leo's weak cries only seemed to amplify the oppressive atmosphere, a desperate, unanswered plea for help that echoed in the silence. Mila no longer knew with any certainty how long they had been held captive in this desolate place, only that each passing day blurred into the next, an endless, monotonous stretch of hours where she and her baby brother were left to slowly starve, imprisoned and forgotten like nothing more than caged animals. Closing her eyes against the persistent gloom, she would often find herself involuntarily recalling the fragmented moments that had led her into this living nightmare, the sharp edges of memory cutting through the dull ache of the present. She remembered the fleeting days of a fragile happiness, a time before everything had fractured and fallen apart, before the darkness had descended. Her mother, a woman worn thin by the relentless hardships of life, but whose heart overflowed with a boundless love, had once been her entire world, her protector, her guiding light. She had worked tirelessly, her small hands calloused and weary, every day a struggle to care for Mila and Leo, to shield them from the worst of life's harsh realities. Even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she always held Mila close, her voice a soothing balm whispering promises that everything would eventually be okay. But not everything could be okay, and not every story, Mila now knew with a bitter certainty, had a miraculous ending. One day, the day the light in their small world began to fade, her mother had collapsed in the cramped kitchen, a violent cough racking her small frame, blood blossoming on her pale palm like a crimson flower. Terrified, young Mila had rushed to her side, her small hands shaking as she tried to rouse her, but her mother only offered a weak, fading smile, her eyes dimming like a candle flickering in the wind, about to be extinguished. That night, under the silent, watchful gaze of the uncaring stars, she had taken her last breath, leaving Mila crying beside her cold, still body, utterly lost and adrift in a world that suddenly seemed vast and terrifying, with no idea what to do next. The neighbors, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and a desire to avoid involvement, did not offer help, did not truly care about the 2 orphan children left to fend for themselves. Some shook their heads in a gesture of fleeting sorrow. Others glanced away quickly, pretending they had seen nothing, their indifference a heavy weight on Mila's young shoulders. Mila did not know how long she had sat beside her mother's lifeless form, her small hand clutching her mother's cold one, only that when the police finally arrived, their presence a stark intrusion into her private grief, they had pulled her away from the stiff, unyielding body, leaving behind an emptiness in her heart that felt vast and unfillable, a void that echoed the silence of the small apartment. And then Grayson had appeared, a figure emerging from the periphery of her shattered world. He had entered their small, grief-stricken home like a self-proclaimed savior, his voice smooth and reassuring as he spoke to the bewildered social workers, claiming to be a distant relative of her mother, a long-lost connection suddenly resurfacing in their time of need. He had pretended to grieve, his eyes dry, but his words laced with a feigned sympathy that Mila, in her heartbroken state, had mistaken for genuine sorrow. He had placed a heavy hand on Mila's small shoulder, his touch feeling cold and unfamiliar, and had promised to take care of her, and little Leo too, his words a soothing balm to her raw grief. Exhausted, emotionally drained, and clinging to any semblance of hope, Mila had believed him. She did not know who this man truly was, did not know where he had come from, but when he had reached out his hand, his eyes holding a deceptive warmth, she had taken it, convinced that he would offer them a better life, a refuge from the storm that had suddenly engulfed them. But she had been terribly, devastatingly wrong. At first, Grayson had played the part of the benevolent guardian with chilling precision. He had given Mila clean clothes that smelled faintly of something unfamiliar but comforting, and had set up a small but tidy room for her and Leo, a space that, in those initial hours, had felt like a sanctuary. He had told her, his voice gentle and reassuring, that she no longer had to worry, that she and Leo now had a home, a place where they would be safe and cared for. But within days, the mask had begun to slip, the veneer of kindness cracking to reveal the cold, hard reality beneath. The small room he had provided became nothing more than a cage, its door a constant reminder of their confinement. At first, the door was locked only at night, a subtle restriction, but soon it was locked all day, their world shrinking to the four walls of that small, oppressive space. Mila was no longer allowed outside unless Grayson needed her for some task, some chore that further cemented her role as a servant rather than a ward. Meals became fewer and farther between. The once seemingly plentiful plates of food dwindled to nothing but stale bread and lukewarm water, barely enough to stave off the constant gnawing hunger. Mila, her small body growing thinner with each passing day, would often starve herself, giving her meager portion to Leo, her priority his survival. But her baby brother still cried through the long, dark nights, his weak wails a constant reminder of their shared deprivation. Whenever Leo's cries persisted for too long, whenever his infant distress threatened to pierce Grayson's carefully constructed facade of normalcy, Grayson would shove the door open, his eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying irritation. "Shut up," he would snap, his voice a low, menacing growl before slamming the door shut again, plunging them back into the oppressive darkness and silence. Over time, Mila learned to anticipate Grayson's volatile moods, learning to cover Leo's mouth with her small hand whenever he cried, trying desperately to muffle every sound, knowing with a chilling certainty that if Grayson lost his patience, the consequences would be far worse than a harsh word. Not long after their arrival, Mila was forced to work like a servant in the very home that was supposed to be their sanctuary. Cleaning, washing, cooking, every menial chore in the house fell on Mila's small, unwilling shoulders. If she did anything wrong, even something as small as dropping a plate in her weary hands or leaving a smudge on the floor in her exhaustion, she was punished. At first, the punishments were relatively minor, a rough shove to the ground, a harsh word, but then came the slaps, sharp and stinging, followed by the heavier blows, the punches that left her small body aching and bruised. Some days, her arms were so bruised and tender she could barely lift them, but she learned not to cry, learned to swallow the pain and the humiliation. She knew, with a grim understanding that belied her age, that showing weakness would not earn her mercy. Grayson had no kindness within him, only a cold, simmering cruelty that seemed to delight in her suffering. Then came the fateful night, the night that had finally spurred her desperate escape. Mila did not sleep, her small body tense and alert even in the darkness. She simply sat in silence on the cold floor, cradling Leo in her arms, her head resting against the unyielding chill of the wall. She had grown accustomed to the perpetual darkness, to the suffocating silence of their prison room. But in the dead of night, Grayson's low, chilling voice had drifted in from the other side of the thin wooden door, his words laced with a casual cruelty that sent a shard of ice through Mila's heart. "The baby's too much trouble," he had muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if talking to himself. "I'll get rid of him first." Mila froze, her breath catching in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could not believe the casual brutality of what she had just overheard, but his voice continued, cold and unwavering, confirming her worst fears. As for the girl, he had added, a chilling finality in his tone, "I've already found a buyer." The world around her seemed to crumble into dust. Mila could not breathe, could not feel anything but the overwhelming tide of terror rising inside her, a suffocating wave of dread. She held Leo tighter, her small chest constricting with panic, her heartbeat so loud in her ears she feared Grayson might hear it through the thin door. If she did nothing, if she remained trapped in this silent prison until morning, Leo would be gone, snatched away into an unknown darkness, and she would be sold, traded like a mere object, vanishing from the world without a trace. Mila knew, with a primal instinct for survival, that she had to escape, that tonight was their only chance. The tension is rising. The danger is escalating with every passing second, and Mila's desperate battle for justice is only getting more intense, more perilous. You won't want to miss what happens next, the desperate choices she will be forced to make. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for the next thrilling chapter in Mila's fight for freedom. Thank you for watching. Darkness, thick and impenetrable, covered the narrow, winding street as Mila clutched Leo tightly to her chest, feeling the faint, weak flutter of the baby's breath against her cheek, a fragile sign of life in the overwhelming gloom. The small, narrow window of their prison room had offered the only viable escape route, a sliver of hope in the suffocating despair, and Mila had had no time to succumb to fear. Driven by a desperate urgency, she had gripped the rough, splintered edge of the window frame, pulling her small body up with every last ounce of strength she possessed, her muscles screaming in protest. Leo had stirred slightly in her arms, letting out a small, distressed cry, a sound that tightened the knot of fear in Mila's stomach, but she dared not stop, dared not falter. Once she had squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping her skin against the rough edges, she had dropped down onto the unforgiving ground below, her bare feet landing hard on the loose, sharp gravel. A jolt of sharp pain shot through her soles, radiating up her legs, but she barely registered it, her mind focused solely on escape. The freezing night air seeped into her thin clothes, making her small body shiver uncontrollably. But Mila had only one thought, one driving imperative. She had to run, had to get as far away as possible from the clutches of Grayson and the horrors he represented. The road ahead seemed endless, a dimly lit ribbon stretching into the inky blackness, illuminated only by the faint, scattered glow of distant street lights, their weak beams swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Mila rushed forward, her bare feet bleeding as they scraped against the sharp, uneven stones, each step a fresh stab of pain. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare glance over her shoulder, because she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Grayson could be right behind her, his fury a tangible presence in the night. Leo cried again, his soft, weak wails cutting through the still night air, a heartbreaking sound that threatened to betray their flight. Mila held him even tighter, pressing her face against his small head, listening to his tiny breaths as a constant reminder that she could not give up, that his survival depended entirely on her. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her small hands numb from the relentless grip on Leo, but she could not stop, could not afford to rest. Every ragged breath, every painful step threatened to bring her down, to force her to succumb to the overwhelming weariness. But her eyes remained locked on the faint, indistinct path ahead, where she desperately hoped to find safety, a haven from the nightmare she was fleeing. Small, dark houses lined the sides of the road, their windows shut tight, their silent facades offering no hint of warmth or welcome. They were faint outlines in the pale moonlight, their stillness amplifying the sense of isolation and vulnerability. Mila slowed her pace slightly, her voice a mere whisper carried away by the cold night wind. "Is anyone there? Please help me," she pleaded into the darkness, her tiny voice barely audible above the sound of her own ragged breathing. But no one answered. A figure emerged from the shadows of one of the porches, a man standing silhouetted against the faint light spilling from a window, smoking a cigarette, his gaze as cold and indifferent as the stone of his porch as he watched her approach. Mila opened her mouth, her lips trembling, ready to pour out her desperate plea. But before she could utter a single word, the man turned abruptly and stepped back inside his house, the heavy wooden door slamming shut with a resounding thud that echoed in the stillness, a definitive rejection. Not a single door opened along the silent street. Not a single light flickered in acknowledgement of her desperate presence. Not a single person seemed to care about the starving, terrified girl and the fragile newborn brother clutched in her arms. Mila bit her lip hard, the metallic tang of blood a sharp reminder of her isolation, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill over. Then, with a renewed surge of desperate energy, she kept running, her small, bleeding feet pounding a silent rhythm on the cold pavement, leaving behind the silent, unwelcoming houses, her only companion the weak cries of her brother and the relentless fear that gnawed at her. At last, when her heavy, uneven steps could carry her no further, when her lungs burned with each gasping breath and her vision swam with exhaustion, Mila saw another light ahead, a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. A small convenience store, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light, stood like an oasis on the desolate road. She staggered toward it, her legs feeling like lead, barely managing to keep herself from collapsing onto the cold asphalt. The store's door, its bell jingling softly, swung open as she stumbled inside, and the rich, comforting scent of fresh bread, mingled with the sweet aroma of coffee, hit her with such force that she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her empty stomach roared in violent protest, a painful reminder of the days of deprivation she and Leo had endured. Leo whimpered softly in her arms, as if he too could sense the proximity of food, the primal hunger gnawing at his tiny body. Mila couldn't even clearly remember the last time she had eaten until she was truly full, the memory lost in the haze of fear and starvation. Her wide, darting eyes scanned the brightly lit shelves, a dizzying array of colors and packages, finally landing on a golden brown loaf of bread sitting invitingly on the counter near the cash register. The loaf was large and perfectly formed, its crust crisp and gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Mila swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry, trying to suppress the overwhelming urge to snatch it and devour it whole. But she knew she couldn't. She glanced around the nearly empty store, noticing that the shopkeeper, a large, stout man with a weary expression, sat behind the counter, his eyes glued to the flickering screen of a small television, seemingly oblivious to her presence. Mila took a hesitant step forward, her movements as light and cautious as a stray cat creeping through shadows. Her trembling fingers reached out, brushing against the warm paper bag encasing the loaf, feeling the soft yieldingness beneath its crispy exterior. She didn't want to do this, didn't want to become a thief, but the desperation for Leo's survival, the gnawing emptiness in her own stomach, left her with no other choice. Her eyes flicked back to Leo, seeing his small, sunken cheeks, the parched dryness of his lips, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that if she did nothing, he wouldn't last much longer. With a surge of adrenaline born of desperation, Mila clutched the bag containing the bread tightly in her small hands, turned to leave the store, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But at that very moment, just as she reached the doorway, a rough, calloused hand suddenly seized her wrist, its grip like iron. She gasped, a small, choked sound of terror escaping her lips, her wide eyes filling with a fresh wave of fear. A loud, booming voice erupted beside her, shaking her to her core. "Thief!" The store owner, a burly man with a hardened face and suspicious eyes that now blazed with anger, stood right next to her, his grip on her small wrist unyielding. Mila tried to pull away, her small muscles straining against his powerful hold, but she couldn't. His hand was too strong, locking her fragile wrist in a painful vice. I didn't, Mila stammered, her voice trembling, but the words died in her throat, choked by fear and guilt. The man yanked her closer, his grip tightening, making her stumble precariously. Then he bellowed, his voice ringing through the small store, drawing the attention of a few startled passers-by outside. "Police! There's a thief!" His shout echoed into the quiet night, and a few curious onlookers stopped to peer through the store's window, their eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a detached indifference. No one asked why such a tiny, frail girl was stealing a loaf of bread. No one questioned why she was clutching a newborn infant in her other arm, her bare feet dirty and bruised. They only saw a thief, a small, insignificant figure caught in the act, and that was enough for them to turn away with a shake of their heads or cast a silent judgment. Within what felt like mere seconds, the distant, mournful wail of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. Mila stood frozen, trapped in the shopkeeper's unyielding grip, her small body trembling uncontrollably, unable to run. Her legs, though bloodied and bruised from the long, painful journey through the night, could do nothing now. As the flashing red and blue lights of the police car painted the store's interior in stark, alternating hues, illuminating her small, tear-streaked face, a wave of despair washed over Mila. In that moment, she knew it was over. She had failed to protect her brother, failed to keep him safe. Her wide eyes, filled with an undeniable, heart-wrenching fear, watched as two uniformed police officers stepped into the store, their expressions stern and impassive. The fight for justice, her desperate attempt to find safety for herself and Leo, was reaching a critical point, a devastating setback. The dangers were growing, the odds stacked against her, and Mila's story was far from over. Keep watching to witness every gripping moment, every twist and turn in her perilous journey. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us as her incredible story unfolds. Thank you so much for your continued support. Her failed escape, her desperate act of theft driven by hunger and love, had led to her swift arrest. And now, just 2 days later, here she was, back in the sterile, intimidating environment of the courtroom, facing not only the cold judgment of the law, but also the menacing presence of Grayson and his carefully constructed web of false accusations. Back in the defendant's chair, which seemed far too large for her small frame, Mila sat silently, her small hands clutching Leo tightly, as if he were the last tangible shield protecting them both from the storm that raged around them. The heavy, unwavering stares of doubt and suspicion from everyone in the room bore down on her, making her feel as if she were physically shrinking, being crushed under the weight of their unspoken judgments. Grayson stood at the witness stand, his demeanor outwardly calm and composed, a stark contrast to his furious outburst moments earlier. But his eyes, when they flickered towards Mila, gleamed with a terrifying coldness, a predatory satisfaction. He held a thick stack of official-looking documents in his hand, flipping through the pages with an air of authority, as if presenting irrefutable evidence. "Your Honor," he began, his deep voice steady and resonating with an air of injured righteousness. "I am the only living relative of Mila and Leo. These are the official papers," he gestured with the stack, proving my direct familial connection to their deceased mother. "As such, I have the legal and moral right, indeed the obligation, to take full responsibility for their care and well-being." He placed the thick stack of papers on the judge's desk, right in front of Judge Sterling, a calculated move designed to project an image of legitimacy. Judge Sterling, his face etched with a professional neutrality, picked up the documents, his sharp eyes scanning each line, each official seal with meticulous care. The courtroom was so silent, the air so thick with anticipation, that the soft rustle of the flipping pages could be heard clearly, each turn of the paper amplifying Mila's growing anxiety. Mila sat frozen in her seat, her wide, dark eyes fixed on the judge, desperately hoping that he would see through Grayson's carefully crafted deception, hoping that some subtle detail, some inconsistency, would betray the falseness of his claims. But Judge Sterling's expression remained unchanged, impassive, and that lack of any discernible reaction only served to amplify Mila's fear, a cold dread tightening its grip around her heart. The prosecutor, an older man with thinning gray hair and a perpetually furrowed brow that spoke of years spent navigating the complexities of the legal system, stepped forward and picked up one of the pages from Grayson's file, his eyes skimming through the dense legal jargon. "These documents seem complete and in order," he stated, his voice thoughtful, but with a subtle undercurrent of doubt. He turned his gaze towards Grayson. "Mr. Grayson, you are claiming to be a direct relative of the children's mother?" Grayson nodded firmly, his expression unwavering, without the slightest hint of hesitation. "That is correct, Your Honor. I stepped forward and took responsibility for caring for Mila and her brother immediately after their mother tragically passed away. It was my familial duty." Mila gripped her small hands so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white, the pressure a physical manifestation of the silent scream trapped within her. She knew these documents were lies, fabrications, carefully forged to support Grayson's sinister plan. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that Grayson had no legitimate relation to her mother, that his claims were a cruel charade. But she had no way to prove it, no evidence to counter his carefully constructed deception. The low hum of murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a subtle shift in the audience's perception. Some people turned to whisper to each other, their glances towards Mila now tinged with a growing suspicion, the initial sympathy replaced by a hesitant doubt. The prosecutor turned his attention to Mila, his gaze more scrutinizing now, his voice taking on a thoughtful edge. "Young lady," he began, his tone softening slightly, "do you have anything to offer to the court that might contradict Mr. Grayson's claims? Any documentation, any evidence that would suggest Mr. Grayson is not, in fact, your relative?" Mila shook her head slowly, the movement small and defeated, feeling as if a heavy weight were pressing down on her chest, squeezing the very breath from her lungs. She had no documents, no birth certificate, no official papers to prove her mother's history, no witnesses willing to step forward and corroborate her story against the seemingly legitimate claims of Grayson. Everything, her future, Leo's safety, depended solely on the uncorroborated words of a child, and in this formal, adult world of legal proceedings that seemed to hold no weight at all. Judge Sterling, after carefully flipping through the last page of the documents, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his expression still unreadable. "These documents appear to be legitimate and in order," he stated, his voice calm but heavy with an undeniable air of authority. "In the absence of any evidence to the contrary, I see no legal reason to doubt Mr. Grayson's stated relationship with the children." A collective breath seemed to be held in the courtroom, the silence amplifying Mila's despair. She wanted to scream, to cry out the truth, to tell them it was all a lie, a carefully orchestrated deception. But no one was truly looking at her, not with understanding, not with belief. Grayson stood tall and self-assured at the witness stand, his posture confident, his eyes holding a gleam of victory, as if he had already won. Even the prosecutor hesitated now, a visible doubt creeping into his gaze as he looked at the small, silent figure of Mila. Mila felt her world crumbling around her, the walls of the courtroom closing in, suffocating her hope. Everyone seemed to believe Grayson's fabricated story, accepting his lies as truth. She clutched Leo tighter, tears silently rolling down her pale cheeks, each one a testament to her growing despair. In her mind, painful memories flashed like a fast-forwarded film. Grayson's cold eyes, the harsh words, the brutal beatings, the terrifying confinement in the dark, airless room, the chilling threats he had whispered in the dead of night. But now, in this formal courtroom, none of that seemed to matter. None of it held any weight without tangible proof. Mila felt as if she were about to collapse under the crushing weight of their disbelief, as if everything, her last fragile hope, was slipping through her fingers. The judge was already convinced by the forged documents. The prosecutor was starting to doubt her, and every last vestige of hope seemed to be fading into the sterile air of the courtroom. But just when it felt as though all was lost, when despair threatened to consume her entirely, Mila suddenly lifted her head, her small chin jutting out with a newfound resolve. Her eyes, though still glistening with unshed tears, blazed not with despair, but with a fierce, unwavering determination that seemed to ignite from the very depths of her being. She held Leo tightly against her chest, took a small, hesitant step forward, and with all the courage that a lifetime of hardship had forged within her young heart, she shouted, her small voice, though trembling slightly, filled with an unshakable strength that echoed in the sudden silence. "No," she cried out, her gaze fixed on the judge. "He tried to kill my brother." The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of murmurs, a wave of doubtful, curious, and bewildered gazes, all fixated on the small figure who had dared to challenge the seemingly established truth. The noise grew louder as her shocking accusation rang out in the solemn space. Some spectators, turning to whisper frantically among themselves, their initial skepticism now tinged with a bewildered curiosity, while others shook their heads in disbelief, their expressions conveying a profound skepticism. Judge Sterling, his initial composure momentarily disrupted by this unexpected outburst, struck his gavel firmly against the polished wooden bench, the sharp crack echoing through the room, his voice resonating with a renewed authority. "Order! Order in the court. This is a courtroom, not a marketplace." The noise gradually died down, the murmurs subsiding into a tense, expectant silence that hung heavy over the room. He turned his sharp, unwavering gaze back to Mila, his expression now a mixture of sternness and a flicker of something akin to reluctant interest. "Young lady," he said, his voice measured, "if you are making such a serious and grave accusation, you need to provide evidence to support your claim." Mila swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry and constricted, as if a heavy rock were lodged within it. She looked around the courtroom, seeing the prosecutor waiting with a skeptical expression, the judge scrutinizing her with a mixture of doubt and curiosity, and Grayson standing at the witness stand, his deceptively calm facade now showing the first cracks of unease. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and adrenaline, but she knew she couldn't back down now. This was her only chance, Leo's only chance. Without hesitating for another second, drawing on a wellspring of courage she didn't know she possessed, Mila took a deep, steadying breath and slowly raised her small hand, pulling up the sleeve of her worn and faded dress. A few gasps echoed through the hushed courtroom as the extent of the injuries came into view under the harsh fluorescent lights. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier than ever, a collective intake of breath as the silent witnesses absorbed the shocking sight. Bruises in various stages of healing stretched along her thin arm, some old, their discoloration fading to a sickly yellow-green, others fresh, dark purple welts that spoke of recent cruelty. An unnerving silence descended upon the entire room, a chilling stillness that replaced the previous skeptical murmurs. Some spectators furrowed their brows in horrified understanding, whispering amongst themselves, their initial judgment dissolving into a dawning realization of the potential horror of Mila's situation. But no one could deny the stark, undeniable evidence laid bare before them. Mila lifted her arm higher, her small hand trembling slightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but filled with a resolute strength that belied her fragile appearance. "This," she said, her voice trembling but firm, cutting through the silence, "this is what he did to me." A woman seated nearby in the gallery turned her face away, unable to bear the sight, while the prosecutor's brow furrowed deeper, his initial skepticism giving way to a grim understanding as he stepped forward, his gaze now fixed on Grayson with a newfound intensity. Judge Sterling, who had initially remained impassive, assuming this was a simple case of a runaway child and a legal guardian seeking to reclaim her, suddenly narrowed his eyes at the sight of the undeniable injuries. He had handled hundreds of cases in his long career, encountered many individuals who fabricated elaborate stories for personal gain, but the raw fear and pain etched in Mila's young eyes, coupled with the undeniable physical evidence, were not something that could be easily dismissed as a fabrication. The prosecutor turned to Grayson, his gaze now sharp and piercing, as if dissecting every possible lie that might form on his lips. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice firm and demanding, "can you explain why this child has these bruises? They appear to be consistent with injuries sustained during the time she was living under your care. I want an explanation now." Grayson's brow twitched almost imperceptibly, a brief flicker of panic in his eyes, but only for a fleeting moment. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure, to project an air of innocent indignation. "These are just bruises," he stammered, trying to sound nonchalant, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "From a clumsy, reckless child. Kids get hurt all the time, falling, bumping into things. These bruises prove nothing," he shrugged dismissively, as if it were nothing more than a trivial matter. But his eyes, darting nervously around the room, betrayed a flicker of unease, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. The prosecutor smirked slightly, unimpressed by Grayson's weak denial. "Prove nothing," he repeated, each word deliberately emphasized, his tone dripping with a subtle menace. "You were the sole legal guardian of young Mila during this period. If these bruises were simply accidental, the result of childhood mishaps, why do they appear repeatedly, showing clear signs of inflicted trauma, of abuse?" He took slow, deliberate steps toward Grayson, his gaze as sharp and unwavering as a honed blade. "Or are we supposed to believe that a malnourished, locked-up child somehow inflicted these patterned injuries upon herself?" The air in the courtroom grew even more suffocating, the previous tension now laced with a palpable sense of outrage. Grayson clenched his fists tightly at his sides, his expression briefly flickering with worry, a raw fear that momentarily stripped away his carefully constructed composure. But within seconds, he forced himself back into a semblance of calmness, a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "I did my best to take care of Mila and Leo," he stated, his voice now carefully measured, but carrying an unnatural stiffness, a forced sincerity that didn't quite ring true. "Children who lose their parents can be difficult. They act out. They can be uncooperative. I try to help them, to provide a stable home. But Mila, she refused to cooperate. She was rebellious, constantly running off. She ran away with her brother, and now she's here, concocting these outrageous accusations, blaming me for her own instability." He scoffed, a theatrical display of wounded innocence, attempting to steer the conversation back in his favor, to paint Mila as a troubled, unreliable child. Judge Sterling had remained silent throughout this exchange, his gaze never leaving Grayson's face, observing every subtle shift in his demeanor, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. Grayson's words sounded superficially reasonable, a plausible explanation for a difficult situation. But something felt profoundly off, a discordant note in his carefully constructed narrative. Mila didn't strike him as a simply rebellious child. If she were merely acting out, seeking attention, why would she have taken her newborn brother with her into the harsh unknown of the streets? And those bruises, he had seen similar marks before in cases of severe child abuse, cases that had left an indelible mark on his conscience. Grayson's cold demeanor, his complete lack of genuine concern or empathy for the children, only deepened the judge's growing suspicion. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his voice taking on a more serious, probing tone. "Mr. Grayson," he began, his eyes narrowing, "I am not entirely convinced by your explanation." He paused for a moment, the silence in the courtroom amplifying the weight of his words, his eyes never leaving Grayson's. "Before making any decisions in this matter, especially given the serious allegations and the visible injuries presented to the court, I am ordering a temporary suspension of these proceedings. I want to verify the legitimacy of the documents you have submitted, and I also want a thorough medical examination of young Mila and her brother." The words cut through the tense air like a sharp blade, a decisive intervention that shifted the balance of power in the courtroom. Some of the spectators nodded in agreement, a collective murmur of approval rippling through the gallery, while Grayson visibly tensed, his carefully constructed composure finally beginning to crumble. His gaze darted around the room, a trapped animal seeking an escape route, and his fists clenched involuntarily at his sides, his knuckles white. Nearby, the security officer who had earlier intervened took note of Grayson's sudden shift in demeanor, his posture becoming more alert, his eyes fixed intently on the witness stand. Grayson blinked rapidly, his hands tightening and loosening. "Your Honor, I think I need some time to," he began, his voice faltering, the smooth confidence gone. But before he could formulate a coherent objection, as the security officer took a step closer, his movement swift and purposeful, Grayson suddenly spun around with surprising speed and lunged towards the side door of the courtroom, his face a mask of desperate panic. Everything happened in a chaotic blur. "Stop him!" the security officer yelled, his voice echoing through the sudden pandemonium, but it was too late. Grayson shoved the heavy door open with a violent force and bolted into the hallway, his footsteps pounding on the marble floor. The security officer immediately took off after him, his long strides quickly eating up the distance. But Grayson had already vanished into the sea of people milling about outside the courtroom, a fleeting glimpse of his retreating figure the last they saw. A second police officer rushed into the courtroom, breathless, his chest heaving. "Your Honor," he gasped, "Mr. Grayson has fled the premises." And at that moment, any lingering doubts in Judge Sterling's mind vanished. He brought his gavel down hard on the bench, the sharp crack a definitive punctuation mark to the dramatic turn of events, his voice ringing with resolute authority. "I am issuing an emergency protection order for Mila and Leo, effective immediately. They are to be taken into protective custody." Mila clutched Leo tightly, feeling her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of relief and a fresh wave of fear washing over her. Grayson had escaped, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't over. He wouldn't simply disappear, he would come back. The police car sped through the darkened streets of the city, its flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the old, worn-down walls of the buildings they passed, casting eerie, dancing shadows. Mila sat curled up in the back seat, her small arms wrapped tightly around Leo, holding him close as if letting go for even a moment would mean losing him forever. Beside her sat Miss Carter, a social worker with kind but firm eyes, her sharp gaze scanning the streets as they sped by, her face etched with a mixture of concern and professional focus. "You'll be safe there," she said gently, her voice a carefully modulated reassurance, but Mila did not respond. She only stared out the window at the thick darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole, the city lights blurring into indistinct streaks of yellow and white. Even though she had escaped the courtroom, escaped the immediate threat of Grayson's presence and the doubting gazes of the onlookers, Mila could not shake the deep-seated fear that clung to her like a shadow. She knew Grayson was still out there, somewhere in the vast, indifferent city, and she couldn't believe that he would simply give up. He had made it clear that he considered her and Leo his property, and she had a chilling premonition that he would stop at nothing to reclaim them. The car turned abruptly down a narrow, tree-lined road, leading them away from the bustling city center. Tall, dense trees loomed on both sides, their branches intertwined overhead, the scarce street lights casting long, eerie, elongated shadows that danced and writhed like ghostly figures. Mila tightened her hold on Leo, a fresh wave of unease creeping in her chest, the sudden isolation of the dark road amplifying her sense of vulnerability. "We're almost there," Miss Carter reassured her, her voice calm. But even she glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, as if afraid that someone was following them through the darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car slowed down and came to a stop in front of a small but sturdy-looking house, tucked away in a quiet, secluded area surrounded by a high wooden fence. The silence that enveloped the house was unnerving, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. The police officers who had accompanied them escorted Mila and Miss Carter out of the car, their sharp eyes scanning the surrounding darkness before nodding in confirmation that the area appeared secure. Miss Carter stepped up to the front door, unlocking it with a practiced ease while Mila followed quietly, Leo still nestled securely in her arms. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a warm, well-lit interior, a stark contrast to the cold darkness outside. The soft glow of yellow light spilled onto the polished wooden floors, creating an immediate sense of comfort and safety. But to Mila, it was not enough to completely chase away the deep-seated fear that had become her constant companion. She stepped inside cautiously, her bare feet light against the smooth wood, as if any sudden sound could shatter this fragile illusion of safety. The door shut behind her with a soft click, sealing her off from the outside world, yet at the same time making her feel strangely trapped in another unfamiliar place. Miss Carter turned to Mila, her voice gentle but firm, her eyes filled with a genuine compassion. "This is a safe house, Mila. You and Leo will stay here until the police find Grayson. There will be officers patrolling outside, and no one can enter without permission. You are safe here." Mila nodded slowly, her gaze still wary, but deep down, a small seed of hope began to sprout in the barren landscape of her fear. She wanted to believe Miss Carter, wanted to believe that any place could truly be safe after what she had endured. Miss Carter led her gently down a short hallway to a small room at the end, a room that had clearly been prepared just for her and Leo. The room was simple but inviting, containing a clean, comfortable-looking bed, a small wooden dresser, and a window overlooking a dark, empty yard. The silence inside the house was so deep that Mila could clearly hear Leo's soft, steady breathing in her arms. With painstaking care, she gently laid him down on the crisp white sheets of the bed, pulling a soft, colorful blanket over his tiny form before finally sinking down onto the edge of the bed beside him, her own exhaustion finally beginning to claim her. The weight of the past few days, the fear, the hunger, the desperate flight, and the terrifying confrontation in the courtroom all crashed down upon her, leaving her feeling utterly drained. But even as her eyelids grew heavy, her gaze remained fixed on Leo's peaceful face, a silent vow etched in her heart to protect him, no matter what the future held. The safe house offered a temporary respite, a moment of fragile peace, but Mila knew, with a chilling certainty that belied her age, that their journey to true safety, to true justice, was far from over. Grayson was still out there, and the fight had just begun.